So as in all our presentations, we are required to provide a legal disclaimer that the presentation is intended solely for general information. It is based on the current information available to us from the Department of Education. And I am not an attorney. If you have legal questions about the information or the program, you need to ask your local legal counsel for advice. We're going to do a brief introduction to the program. Then we're going to really jump into completing the budget schedules, and Tasha Clifton's going to cover that portion. That'll take about 25 minutes. If we have time, she'll answer some questions on the budget schedules at the end of her presentation. Then we're going to move into the general information on the application through the provisions, assurances, certifications, into the program description schedules. Finish up the afternoon with a quick look at some of the grant resources, making sure you know where to find the information that you look for, and then determine how much time is left at the end of the training session. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can get to. So it's important to note that all the ESSER 3 program information is available on our department ESSER 3 grant page. We have redesigned that page in the last couple of days to shorten the link address, and to make it a little bit easier, we separated a separate page for ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3 to make it easier for navigation. I also want you to be aware that we are recording today's training. As a registered attendee, you will automatically get an email that sends you the information to access the recording of the session. It will also be made available on the Grant Compliance Administration playlist on the agency's YouTube channel at the link that's provided. This is the same link where we post all of our department trainings, and every training we've held for the past year, we have recorded and posted on this one playlist. So if you bookmark that one link, you will always have access to recordings of our training. If you haven't found the grant application for ESSER 3, you'll go to the TEA Grant Opportunities web page. The link is for you on the slide. It's always easier if you know the name of the application you're searching for. So this application is named 2020 through 2023 ARP ESSER 3 Federal Grant Application. You search for that application, and Opportunities page will open the page dedicated to the ESSER 3 grant application. You will see a brief program description, the statutory references, and other basic information about the grant. And as you scroll down, you will get to the application and support information. Very important to notice that the general fiscal guidelines at the top and then program guidelines in the middle will give you all the rules for your ESSER 3 grant application. And then there are general provisions and assurances again toward the top, and then the program specific provisions and assurances, many of which you will be certifying to in the grant application, and any that are not specified where you check a box to certify them, they are all incorporated into your notice of grant award by reference. 3 items up from the bottom, you have a PDF sample application that you can use for planning purposes. But let me remind you, this application is in eGrants, and it must be submitted through eGrants. We've already had people try to complete the PDF and email it to us. That's how we had to submit ESSER 1 application, but this is a much better way to collect the application from you by having it built in the eGrant system. So you will be logging into eGrants. Anyone who's an authorized user who has the access to submit an application will go into the eGrant system to submit your application. Always refer to the general fiscal guidelines and the program guidelines for the rules around this application. So we're going to go into a section on completing the budget schedules, and Tasha Clifton is going to cover this information with you. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and she will bring up the slides for the next section.
Hello, I hope everyone is hanging in there and having a great afternoon so far. It is a beautiful day in Austin, Texas, sunny, 70 degrees, and it's Friday afternoon, so it can't get much better than that. As Corey mentioned, I'm Tasha Clifton, a manager at Grants Administration at TEA. I am over one of the negotiator teams that help you complete your grants. Today, we're going to walk through completing the ARP ESSER 3 budget schedules. Now, when you arrive at this point, you are well on your way. It means that you've already received access to TEAL, you've received access to eGrants, and you've submitted your applicant designation and certification form. So it should be smooth sailing from here. We haven't received a lot of applications at this point, maybe about 14, but a lot of folks have started working on their ADCs. Maybe about 500, and we have 60 ADCs in process. So if we tell you nothing else today, we encourage you to submit early because we are approaching the summer months, which are our busiest season. There's a lot of activity in eGrants with about 1,200 ESSER consolidated applications, 700 special education applications, over 400 Perkins applications. So you want to be first in line. So if we tell you nothing else today, go ahead and get your applications in. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. Okay, are you able to see the presentation?
Yes, but you need to run it as a slideshow.
Okay, just wanted to make sure you can see it. Okay, good deal. All righty. Now, if you've completed applications for any of our major eGrants applications, ESSER Consolidated, Perkins, or Special Education, the budget schedules will be very familiar to you. It's going to be a piece of cake. Over the last 2 years, Grants Administration has worked to streamline the eGrants applications to only include the information that's necessary to award the grants, and also to make the budget schedules look and function the same so that it's easier for you. The first schedule that you're going to come to is BS 6001, your program budget summary and support schedule. This is a snapshot of all of the costs for your grant by class object code. And we're going to take a look at the BS 6001 over the next couple of slides. This first screenshot that you're looking at displays Part 1, available funding. Line 3 of Part 1 is going to pre-populate with your allocation. Your current award amount is 2/3 of the full award. The remaining 1/3 is going to be awarded later. And you will need to submit an amendment in eGrants to claim those additional funds once it becomes available. This is also the number that you will use for your 20% set aside on your PS 3014. Part 2 of the budget summary is a summary of your cost by class object code. You're going to start here by entering the total cost for each class object code, like payroll, supplies and materials, other operating costs, and so forth. If you have any indirect costs, line 9 is where you will budget those. Now on this schedule, you'll need to budget for your full award amount. And you'll notice at the bottom of the screen in blue, total budgeted cost. And this is a total of all of the funds for the class object codes that you've entered for the line above, in the lines above. Right below that, you'll see a total funds available minus total cost line. And what you want to see there is 0. If you see any amounts in that line, it means you need to add it in the lines above, because that's just a difference between your award amount and what you have budgeted. For any of the costs that you have identified on BS 6001, the program budget summary, you will need to complete the supporting budget schedules, starting with BS 6101, which is the payroll cost schedule. The snapshot that you have before you is part 1, total payroll cost. And this is going to be one of your favorite parts of the application because you don't do anything here. The total payroll cost line is going to pre-populate with the amount that you entered on the BS 6001 for payroll cost. Part 2, number and type of positions, is where you will provide the details regarding any payroll positions that you're funding by the grant. If you budget costs for any of these positions in Section A, administrative support or clerical staff, you will enter the number of direct administrative staff for your grant program. Now, this is the only place you will enter a number on this schedule. Parts B and C are just checkboxes. Section B, LEA positions, is where you identify if you have any LEA positions that meet the description of the items on lines 1 through 3. If you do, and you're budgeting costs for those positions in the grant, you're going to check the box next to that line. Same thing for Section C, campus positions. If you have any campus level positions that meet the description of those line items and you are paying for those through the grant, you simply check the box next to that item. Now, whether a position is considered a campus level position or an LEA position is defined by the local level, by the LEA. TEA does not make that distinction. Part 3, substitutes, extra duty pay, and benefits. If you budgeted costs for any of these items, check the box next to that line as well. And this is for school-wide personnel, stipends and extra duty pay, substitutes and incentive pay. Sometimes we receive questions about the difference between stipends and incentive pay. Those again are defined at the local level. Confirmation of payroll cost in Part 4. I know there have been some questions about this. You are required to check this box to certify that any payroll positions budgeted are reasonable, necessary, allowable, and allocable for the grant program. The second part of the certification is related to the supplement not supplant provision. The statement says certify compliance with federal supplement not supplant provision for applicable fund source. Supplement not supplant does not apply to this fund source. So by checking this box, you are still in compliance. The program guidelines that are attached to the grant state that supplement not supplant does not apply. Professional and contracted services, BS 6201 is next. It's going to be broken out over the next couple of slides so that you can have a good look at it. Part 1 is what is displayed. Total professional contracted services cost at the bottom will pre-populate with the amount that you entered on BS 6001 budget summary. The total amount will also appear initially in the remaining costs that do not require specific approval line. If you are budgeting all of your costs for remaining costs that don't require specific approval, you won't need to do anything at this point. You would just save this schedule and then move on to the next one. If, however, you need to budget things like rental or lease in buildings or professional and contracted services that do require specific approval, you will need to identify the cost on lines 1 and 2 as appropriate. And then those items will be deducted from the remaining costs that do not require specific approval line. For any cost that you enter on Part 1, Line 2, the Professional and Consulting Services line, you will need to itemize those on the next section. That's Part 3. You will need to enter a brief description of the item, like professional development, the purpose of the service, like professional development for teachers on remote learning, and you will need to enter a dollar amount for the activity. If you need to add additional lines, just click Add Item. If you need to delete an item, press Delete Item. Once you have added all of your items in this part, you'll get a total at the bottom, and this total will be validated against the amount that you entered in Part 2. We encourage you, if you don't put anything in Part 1, Line 2, then you won't need to complete this schedule. And we ask that you complete Part 1 first, because the validations don't work backwards. In other words, you can put something in Part 3 first, and you're going to have to submit a revision because the system won't catch it. So if you're completing BS 6201 and any other grant schedules, really, start from top to bottom. We also ask that you do not include any brand names or specific entity names in your descriptions. If you do and you decide to later go with a different brand name or entity name, then you would be required to submit an amendment. The next schedule, BS 6401, is other operating cost. You will use this schedule to break out costs like travel, stipends to non-employees, publication and printing, and educational field trips. And this is just a snapshot of what the entire schedule looks like. Again, most of the budget schedules function really similarly. So the total operating cost at the bottom of the schedule is going to pre-populate with any amount that you entered for other operating costs on the budget summary page. You'll also see the amount initially in the remaining costs that do not require specific approval line. And if you only budgeted cost for items that don't require specific approval, like in-state travel for your employees or registration fees for in-state travel for your employees, you won't need to do anything else with this schedule. You'll just save it and then move on to the next one. Now, here's a closer look at the line items on BS 6401. And if you do need to budget cost for any of these items, just put the dollar amount on the line next to the item. And so you would do that for items 1 through 6, like out-of-state travel, educational field trips, etc. Line 7, hosting conferences, is not allowable for this grant. Because this is a generic template that we will use with multiple grants, and because we needed to get this one out super quick, we weren't able to disable this line 7, hosting conferences. So don't put anything there unless you want to be contacted by your negotiator to remove it. I wanted to also point out that some of these line items require documentation. So you want to make sure to read the information that's located on the line. For example, out-of-state travel for employees, the LEA must keep documentation locally. Like number 6, non-employee costs for conferences requires pre-authorization in writing. So there's special forms, and those, number 6 is considered participant support costs. So those require special approval. So all of the forms for these types of items are located on the TEA website, and we'll show you how to find those later on in this presentation. BS 6601 is capital outlay. All capital outlay requires specific approval. And again, this schedule functions just like the other schedules. The total that you have budgeted on BS 6601, BS 6001, sorry, will appear at the bottom of this schedule in the total capital outlay cost line. And you will initially see it also on line 3, furniture, equipment, vehicles, or software. Now, if you need to rebudget those items, if you have costs for library books and media that are controlled by the library, or for capital expenditures, you will need to budget cost on those lines. And the amount that you enter there will be deducted from the amount that's in line 3. I wanted to point out that construction is a special cost. Any construction cost will need to be approved by Corey, and there will be specific forms to request approval for those later. If you include cost for furniture, equipment, vehicles, or software in Part 1, you will be required to itemize those in Part 2. Request one item per line. For example, if you are purchasing desktop computers and laptop computers, those are separate and those would need to go on separate lines. Enter a generic description for each item. Again, no brand names like Apple or Dell, because we don't want you to have to submit an amendment just to change the name. Enter the total number of units. Fund source will be disabled because this is only one fund source. And enter the total cost. For example, if your LEA is required to capitalize items at $1,000 and you're purchasing 10 laptops for $1,000 each, you would enter 10 as the number of units and $10,000 as the total cost. Finally, in this section, you want to describe how the items will be used to meet the grant objectives. Ideally, you want to tell us who will use the item and how it's tied to the grant. For example, laptops for teachers for online instruction. Once you enter all of the items in Part 2, you'll get a total, and the total is going to validate against the amount in Part 1, line 3. If for some reason the numbers don't match, you'll receive an error message and you won't be able to submit your application. Now, you may hear about this more than once today, but I wanted to go over this really quickly. You will also have to submit CS 7000 provisions, assurances, and certifications as part of your application. This schedule contains links to the guidelines, provisions, and assurances, debarment and suspension information, as well as lobbying certification information. If you click on the blue buttons, they'll take you to the actual documents. We ask that you read all of those documents and select the check boxes to the left of them. Certifying and submitting the application indicates that you intend to comply with all of the documents listed there. Now, these are some of the resources that will help you as you complete your grants. Corey walked through the TEA Grant Opportunities page earlier, and I tell everyone that's completing any type of grant that the TEA Grant Opportunities page is going to be your best friend. It has a lot of information there where you don't have to ask anyone. You just go right to the page. You know where the guidelines are. You know what the application deadlines are. It tells you how to apply. There's links to general fiscal guidelines on the Grant Opportunities page, and the General Fiscal Guidelines link is also on this resources page. Administering a grant, I have linked that as well because the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook is there. In the Budgeting Cost Guidance Handbook, you will find a lot of information. What I find it particularly useful for is helping to identify what types of costs require specific approval and which ones don't require specific approval. And it has helpful definitions for each of the class object codes There's also information on amending an application. Helps you determine whether or not you need to submit an application. And all of those forms that I mentioned previously are located under forms for prior approval, disclosure, and justification. So that's going to be your out-of-state travel justification form, your field trip form, and your participant support cost forms. If you are having any difficulties or have any questions about completing your grant application, it's best to reach out directly to one of our ESSER grant negotiators. They are listed on the Grants Administration's contacts page. If you click on that link, it will take you there, and we try to keep the contact information updated there. You can also reach us by contacting us directly at 512-463-8525. And those are the end of my slides, so I'm going to stop sharing here. And let me know if you guys have any questions.
Tasha, I've been monitoring the Q&A a little bit here. There's a couple of questions on, are indirect costs allowable? Do they need to be budgeted on the grant application?
Indirect costs are allowable for this grant. Indirect costs generally are not required to be budgeted in the grant application. But the expenditure reporting system will hold you accountable to indirect costs.
Okay. There's a couple of different types of questions for the payroll cost schedule, such as positions that are not listed on that schedule. Where would something like custodial and maintenance positions go?
You will have to fit any positions into those categories, and it's up to the LEA how you categorize those. So it has been our experience that all staff can fit into those categories. And I wanted to go back to the indirect cost question really quickly. It's your unrestricted rate that you're going to be using with this. But like I said, indirect costs really aren't required to be budgeted. But if you're like me, I want to see where everything is going. So I would budget the indirect costs, but the expenditure reporting system is what will hold you accountable to that.
Okay. Does capital outlay include improvements to ventilation, water fountains, and the like, HVAC, and filters?
I know that has been a really hot topic lately, and I'm going to hand that one over to Corey.
Okay.
Let me just go ahead and answer it real quick. Whether that's considered capital outlay depends on your capitalization threshold. Whether you're using the federal $5,000 capitalization threshold, or if your LEA has a lower threshold, you use the lower $5,000 or your local policy threshold, whichever is less. And so for some people, HVAC, water fountain, those types of activities they will be capitalized, while other people, they will not. It's going to depend on the total cost and your capitalization threshold.
And let's see, if our capitalization threshold is greater than $5,000, do we code the laptops and tablets to BS 6300 basically?
You are not allowed to have a capitalization threshold greater than $5,000. LEAs may have a capitalization threshold that's lower, but not greater than $5,000.
But I think also in that case, if your capitalization level is $5,000, then unless you have a specific local policy, otherwise your laptops and tablets would go under 6,300 but you would have to, basically tag them. You know, they're easily walkable. You got to maintain that inventory somehow. Is that correct?
Right. It's going to be based on your local capitalization threshold, whether they're supplies or capitalized as capital outlay. Also, depending how the invoice is written, but most of the times, laptops, tablets, Chromebooks, hotspots, those items are mostly going to be supplies, but you do have to track all assets by federal regulation. So even though they're not capitalized as equipment, and they're not on the official equipment inventory, you do have to have some type of tracking inventory for those items. So we'll come back to more questions. I want to go ahead and run through the rest of it, and then we'll spend the time at the end and make sure we answer as many questions as possible. So we're going to go back to the rest of the program schedules, starting with some of the general information. And you're going to hear me duplicate a little bit of what Tasha talked about in some of these schedules, but that's because we want to make sure we, give it full time and the importance of it. So your general information on GS 2100 is your applicant information. Part A is the applicant organization, B is your DUNS number. Part C has your primary and secondary contacts. And so it's very important that you list someone who will be able to be reached and who will be able to discuss the application contents in case we need to negotiate your application. And keep in mind that we negotiate applications all through the summer. We do not take off anytime during the summer months. That's our busiest season. So whoever's listed as primary and secondary should be prepared to receive a phone call or email and be able to respond to questions from our negotiation staff. The provisions, assurances, and certifications section, Tasha talked about this. I want to reiterate just a little bit. It is one of the simplest schedules to complete. You check the boxes and you hit submit and you move on. But this is the schedule that ties you to all the legal federal requirements. So someone in your LEA needs to make sure you have read all the documents behind these blue buttons, because when your authorized official certifies and submits this application, you're certifying compliance to all of these federal requirements that are listed in these documents. We're going to spend the rest of the time on the program description schedules. There's basically 3 schedules that are tied to the program description. PS 3013, PS 3014 are your primary program schedules. Then PS 3400, your equitable access and participation, which is programmatic in nature, but it's not specific to the program. That is a required schedule by federal regulation of all federal grants. So we're going to start with program schedule 3013, your program plan. This schedule is where we have listed all the allowable activities out of statute. There are 15 allowable activities in statute, many of them with multiple activities in each one. So we have broken them out, but you can track these straight to the ESSER 3 statute. And in this section, use of funds, section A and then section B, because section A doesn't allow us to get all the uses in one section. So they're broke over 2 sections, A and B. So in these 2 sections, you're going to indicate your planned use of the ESSER 3 grant funds. And you're going to tell us by time period when you plan to expend funds on the related activity. So you have options for pre-award, which has been authorized by USDE, and it is to start cost March 13th of 2020 through any cost you've incurred up to the date you submit this application to TEA. Then you have cost in the 2021 school year, including the summer of 2021. And then you have the 21-22 school year, 22-23 school year, and 23-24 school year, which is your 12-month carryover period. You also have an option of not applicable. So you must check one of these boxes for each activity, telling us pre-award, the school year, including the summer, or not applicable, meaning you will not expend grant funds on that specific activity. And you have those same checkbox options for all 28 of the allowable activities, the way we've broken them out. We broke them out that way to be able to track for federal reporting purposes, but they do align to the statutory allowable activities. So 3013 has the program use of funds in parts A and B. And these are important program schedules because the information you're putting in those two sections does track to part of the required contents of your ESSER 3 LEA use of funds plan that is required by the federal rules. So part A, part B, all about the allowable activities. And again, we just couldn't get all 28 activities to fit in one section, so they're broken out, those 28 activities broken out over the two sections. Part C is your needs assessment process. This should look very familiar to you from the ESSER 1 application. You're going to basically just indicate to us the type of needs assessment process you followed to determine what the needs are that have been created by the COVID-19 pandemic. So you must check at least one item, and you can check multiples. So you're going to check everything that applies to you. If none of the pre-printed options fit the needs assessment schedule you followed, go to the bottom of the question, and there's an option for the LEA completed a different needs assessment process not described above. So you will have to mark at least one item on this question. And no, it does not impact your application if you select the last one saying you did something different. You just have to tell us that you did something different, and if we have any question about it, we'll ask you later. Second question under part C is the prioritization. How did you prioritize all those needs that you identified through your needs assessment process? So how did you prioritize those needs and decide how you will spend your ESSER funding? Now with ESSER 3, the allocations are quite large for your district. So you may not have to prioritize needs. You may have enough money under ESSER 3 to meet all the needs you identified in your needs assessment process. And if so, you simply go to the last option on the question, all needs met, no prioritization needed. But you must mark at least one item on this schedule, and you can mark multiples. So you mark everything that applies, remembering you must mark at least one to get the application approved. Part D is a question on the exemptions for maintenance of equity. Maintenance of equity is a new requirement in the ESSER 3 statute. USD has not yet released any information or guidance or data about the calculation process for maintenance of equity. All we have is literally what's in the statute. We do know there are exemptions to the maintenance of equity provision, and that's what this question is asking you about in D1. It's asking you, is the LEA exempt from the required maintenance of equity provision? And you'll either answer no or one of the yes options, or maybe. So is your LEA exempt from maintenance of equity? Maybe not, so you would mark no, the first option. If you're exempt because you have less than 1,000 total student enrollment, you mark that option. If you're exempt because you only have one campus within your LEA, you are a K-12 campus or you are a K-8 campus and that's the only campus in your LEA, then you mark that option. You have the option to be exempt if you also only have one campus per grade span. Maybe that's an elementary, middle school, high school, 3 campuses within the LEA, all serving different grades. and no two campuses serve the same grade span. Because we put elementary, middle school, high school, does not mean that is the only campus structure that can be exempt under this provision. You could have a primary that's K2, an elementary that's 3-5, middle school 6-8, and high school 9-12. The key to this exemption is that you have no grade level duplication between campuses, and all your students in one grade level are housed on one campus. Then you have the two maybe options, and you're not straight out exempt from the maintenance of equity, but you plan to apply to USDE for a waiver. So then you're going to check one of the maybe options, and maybe you'll be exempt because you're going to apply for a waiver for exceptional or uncontrollable circumstances. This might be a huge decline in enrollment due to the pandemic. Or the last option, you're going to apply to USD for the waiver because of the precipitous decline in financial resources in the LEA. So the question on maintenance of equity is all about the exemption. If you have over 1,000 students, you have multiple campuses with a grade span, you're going to mark no. Only if you are exempt do you mark one of the yes options, or if you think you're going to apply for a waiver, you mark one of the two maybes. Part E is the required assurances, and these are active certifications to the assurances, meaning you have to check the box. You have to check all of them for the application to be approved. They are very specific assurances to federal requirements, so you need to read through these as you check them off before you submit your application. So Schedule 3014 is about your program narrative. And in this new format in eGrants, to be able to create an eGrant application in a week or two versus 6 to 9 months, which is the standard process, we only have program schedules like you saw on PS 3013, which has checkbox responses, or you have a 3014, which is all narrative. Now, for this purpose under ESSER 3, we need a question that's a short answer, but we don't have that feasibility under this ESSER the eGrant application, because that would have been a 6 to 9 month build to have all those different types of questions. So you're going to have to pay attention on this narrative schedule 3014 and really read what we're asking for, because you don't want to give us a lot of extra information. Because if you give us a lot of extra information, we're required to read it and react to it. And you might tell us extra things that cause you additional negotiation. So pre-award is section A, and the question is to enter the dollar amount of ESSER 3 funds to be charged as pre-award costs for the activities you listed in sections A and B of PS 3013. And these are the activities that occurred from March 13th, 2020 through the application submission date. So this question ties back to 3013 Part A and B, your activities where you were telling us either pre-award or the school year where you would spend that money. So go back to 3013. Any activity that you mark the first option as pre-award, you need to add up the dollar amount associated with all those checkboxes. And you are going to enter here on this question, A1, simply the total amount of money you're requesting pre-award approval of. In this application, we are not asking you separate questions by line item or by class object code of how much you're asking for pre-award. It's all consolidated. You're telling us the activities through the pre-award check on program schedule 3013. And then you tell us the total dollar amount you're requesting pre-award approval under question A1. Section B of this schedule is to collect information about your required 20% set aside for learning loss that is required in statute. So in ESSER 3 statute, you must spend a minimum of 20% of your allocation for activities to support learning loss, which includes evidence-based activities related to summer learning, summer enrichment, extended school year, extended day, those types of strategies. And the second part of that requirement is that the activities are addressing not only academic, but social, emotional, and mental health needs of staff and students. So you have this 20% set aside. In section B here is the description of how you're meeting that 20% set aside requirement. Now, in your original application, you're only addressing the 20% set aside of the 2/3 allocation that's in your budget. Once the state receives the remaining 1/3 of ESSER 3 funding from the federal government, then you will have a process to amend this application and amend your budget to increase your budget up to the full amount of your award. And you will have to adjust these program schedule questions at that time. So what you're working with now is that 2/3 amount that's in your budget, and then describing in these questions here how you're using that 20% set aside or meeting that 20% set aside requirement. So B1, you're going to enter the total dollar amount of the ESSER 3 funds in your budget that will be expended to meet the 20% set aside for learning loss through after school, summer school, extended year, and targeting students from low-income families, students of color, English learners, children with disabilities, students experiencing homelessness, students in foster care, and migrant students. So that is the 20% set aside requirement. So again, B1, you're only giving us the total dollar amount. It must equal or exceed 20% of your total budget on BS 6001 that Tasha talked about. So there will be a mathematical calculation. You will want to ensure the number you enter on B1 is at least 20% of your total budgeted amount on your budget schedule. Then when you get to B2, you're finally going to put a real narrative response in these program narrative questions. So in B2 and B3, you're going to give narrative responses describing the activities that you've represented in check boxes back on the 3013 schedule. This is to meet the requirements of your LEA uses of funds plan. So in B2, we're asking you specifically about questions A16, A17, B1, B2, and or B3. Those are the 5 allowable uses that meet the requirement for this 20% set aside around the requirement for evidence-based activities for after school, summer school, extended year, those type programs. So since you must provide a description in this question, you must have marked at least one box on one of those activities, A16, A17, B1, B2, or B3. You're checking the activity on the 3013 schedule, but here, because of this plan requirement, you have to enter a narrative description of those activities, how you're spending monies on those type activities to meet that 20% set aside requirement. B3 is basically the same thing. It's meeting a different part of that planning requirement. So you're going to briefly describe in narrative form how you answered the question A6, A13, A15, A17, B1, B2, and or B3. And yes, there is overlap on these two questions between B1, B2, and B3. So you may have some overlap of your narrative response if you mark any one of those 3 options on the first schedule that actually overlap between these two questions. But again, because you are required in the planning requirement to provide a narrative description of these activities, you have to have checked at least one box in one of those questions. So there is a correlation between these two narrative questions and the allowable use activities that are on program schedule 3013. Section C is a question about your safe return to instruction and continuity of services plan. And you're going to enter simply the web link, the direct URL link on your LEA webpage, where you will post both your safe return to in-person instruction and continuity of services plan, and it's the same place you would be posting the LEA use of funds plan. So program schedule 3013 and 3014 in your application contain all the content requirements that are required in your uses of fund plan. So you will either post those two schedules as your use of funds plan, or create a separate summary document of that information to post on your website to meet the requirement for your use of funds plan. And remember, your plans have to be formatted by the federal requirement. They have to be in a language to the extent practical the parent can understand, or if not practicable to translate to another language, you have to provide oral translation to parents. And upon request, they must be provided in an alternative format to any parent who is an individual with a disability. So originally, we would have recommended just posting these two application schedules for your use of funds plan. But the more we've dealt with the Department of Ed and heard information from them, now I really recommend you just create a separate summary document of that information, because you are going to have to translate it in most cases, at least to Spanish and potentially other languages as well. Now, the question comes up, how do you determine what languages you have to translate these plans into before posting them on your website? So what you do is you should already have a written translation policy in your LEA. You have similar requirements like this under Title I and some of your other federal programs. So you should already have a written translation policy that defines the documents and what languages you translate written documents into for your district or charter school. When we monitor you, we will be expecting you to be following that local policy. So when we do the program compliance validation on format of the plans, one of the things we'll ask you for is that written policy on written translation. And then we will ask for copies of the documents, the two plans in each one of those languages. The easy way for us to validate this after we get your actual policy is you're required to post these plans in the various languages on your website. And in this question C1, you're simply giving us just the direct URL link where we can click on that link and it will open your web page and we will find those plans there on your web page. And we would find those plans in whatever languages your policy says you translate into. So this is another one of those questions where it is a very specific short answer. You don't want to give us a lot of extraneous information, because anything extra you send us through, we're required to look at it. And if we see anything questionable, we then have to negotiate it as part of your application. So just give us the direct URL where you will post your plans. Section D meets the last requirement for the ESSER use of funds plan. And it is a description of how much and how you will use ESSER 3 funds for prevention and mitigation strategies consistent with CDC guidelines. So again, you're going to give us a brief description of the questions that you marked on 3013 under A5, A8, A9, B5, B6, B7, B8, and or B9. Those are the activities that most closely align to CDC recommendations. So, but this one's different. You don't have to have marked one of those items because of the way the federal requirement is worded. And so this one, you may simply put that last sentence, no prevention or mitigation strategies funded. Now, I'm also getting a lot of questions around this requirement from the plan. Many of you, your local boards, have already made policies and done away with mask requirements or made masks optional. CDC does, until I think yesterday, they were very strong on wanting to require masks. I think if you go back and read the newest information that came out yesterday, CDC has backed off of that somewhat. So people are concerned that if you already have a board policy to make masks optional or not required, that it's going to cause a problem with your ESSER 3 funding. No, it doesn't. You have to address those CDC guidelines in your return to in-person instruction plan and talk about any policies you have, but simply not requiring masks does not impact your eligibility for your ESSER 3 funding. So on this question, you're just describing the activities that you marked in these specified questions on 3013. Or if you didn't spend money on these type of activities for ESSER, you don't plan to, you simply add that statement there, no prevention mitigation strategies funded. The last schedule is program schedule 3400, Equitable Access and Participation. This should look familiar. You fill out a very similar schedule in every federal grant application. This is a requirement that these questions be asked, and that equitable access and participation, any barriers to access and participation are addressed in any application for an award from the federal government. Just to be honest with you, I've never in 26 years at TEA had auditors follow up on these schedules. All they do is check to make sure that we include it in the application and that you at the LEA level did complete it. So it is required, but you do not need to worry about how you complete this application that much. You just need to complete it. And you can check the first radio button. You're assuring there's no barriers that exist to equitable access and participation. Checking that box does not impact your application in any way, nor does checking the second radio button saying there are barriers, and then which you then drop down on the select one drop-down bulletin and you determine the group of intended beneficiary that has a barrier and you describe it. And you do that same process for however many barriers you've identified. You have to complete the schedule, but your responses do not impact your eligibility for funding. So I want to talk real quick a little bit about the resources, and Tasha hit on some of these. The URL, the URL is at the very top of the slide. There's a lot of resources for you on the grants administration site. The division contact information that Tasha talked about, and very piece of the description under division contacts. And I pulled out the whole list of contacts. You're really looking at the blue line in the middle. These are the ESSER negotiators. Stephanie, Christy, and Laura have worked with these grants from the beginning and are very familiar with them. We're in the process of trying to get a few more staff hired now that ESSER 3 is coming on board and ESSER 2 will come out eventually. If y'all have any questions about expenditure reporting, those contacts are listed for you there as well at the bottom. Or if you have questions about other programs, your normally assigned grant negotiator is listed in the top half of the page. So that place on the website is where you can always find this updated list that Tasha was talking about earlier. Now there's additional grant resources available specific to the ESSER programs on our department ESSER site, and you can come down where we've broken out ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3, and you click on the ESSER 3 grant program link, and it pulls up the ESSER 3 page where you can find all the information. We've pulled a lot of the applicant information to this page as well. So if you get on this page instead of grant opportunities, you can still find most of the same information. The entitlements are posted there on the bottom of the screen. You see the link where you can access all the entitlements. Keep scrolling down that page and you will see the information on statewide training and Q&A sessions. This is where you register yourself for any of our training sessions related to ESSER 3. You can see there the grant program overview is available, the planning and compliance requirements presentation from the training on Tuesday is available, the PowerPoint and the recording of the actual training. This recording and the materials for today will be updated onto this page as well. They'll also be emailed out to you after the session. And then you have the registration links for future trainings. And right now, what we've got scheduled over the next 2 weeks is 2 live Q&A sessions per week, where there will be no presentation, there will be no training. It will simply be a live Q&A session where you can come on and ask questions or come on and listen and learn from other people asking questions. We have 4 of those sections completed. If we need more training opportunities or more Q&A sessions, we will add those. At the bottom of that section, you see a link that says complete and submit this form to submit your questions. That is the form where you can submit questions that will be added to the FAQ document. Also note, if you're still emailing us the questions, all questions have to go through a review process. And so we can't just immediately write back and give you the answer. And if you're asking the question, most of the time somebody is wanting to know the same question. So we're taking those questions, putting them through the review submission process. You will see the answers come out in the FAQ document. And the FAQ is the next link on that page under the FAQ heading. And it is being updated regularly. Right now, it's being updated almost every day. If you haven't looked at that FAQ, I kind of encourage you to read it relatively quickly because it's just growing larger and larger. There's already 80-something questions in that FAQ. After Tuesday's training on the planning requirements, I've added about 50 more, and I've got about another 160 questions just off Tuesday trainings that I'm trying to work through and get answered and get reviewed and approved to add to the FAQ. And I'm sure after today's training, that number will go up. We will process through those. We're trying to do as many questions in an update daily. The reason I say read it now while it's shorter is we've got it programmed that every time we add a new question, it puts that new question in green text for 5 days. If I happen to change an answer and need to update a previously provided answer, it flips those questions to red for 5 days. So at least you can quickly see if there's been a change to a response or if we've added new questions. Right now, half the document is green because they've been added so many questions in the last 2 or 3 days. So if you scroll over to the right on that document, you will see a date added column where you can always check for the most recent questions that have been added to that FAQ document. And at the bottom of the page, you can find the governor's announcement and the TTAA letter that announced ESSER 3 as well. So all your information is between, you can find it on the grant opportunities page, everything related to the application, or everything programmatic, which includes a lot of the application information here on the department ESSER page. I want to run through this timeline real quick. We released allocation amounts on April 27th and released the application with the plan use of funds plan requirements incorporated into it on April 28th. Your application, which includes that information for use of funds plan, is due to TEA by July 27th. That is a 90-day window that is set in rule by USDE. USDE recommended a shorter time frame and especially not to exceed 90 days. Because of these new planning requirements, we chose to give you the full 90 days to get the planning process done as much as you can, which includes that stakeholder input, public notice, and comment period. So we gave you the full 90 days. So your application and that information in those application schedule that meets the use of fund plan requirements, that's due July 27th. We will start reviewing and negotiating applications in the order they come in. As they come in, I want to reiterate what Tasha said. You want to submit as early as you can, but at the same time, we understand you can't rush that planning process and that stakeholder input process. But the earlier you get the application in, the earlier you will be in line to be reviewed and negotiated. Important to remember in this timeline that once you receive the notice of grant award on the application, you then have 30 days to post both your plans in the translated languages as well to your website. And let me remind you, you're telling us in that question in the application, the direct link to the website where those plans will be posted. We are literally going to click on that link and expect to find your plans, and that will be part of our compliance monitoring. So that's the link we're going to be looking at, and please don't make us go looking all through your LEA website to find your plans. Last thing I want to cover before we try to answer some of your questions is just to reiterate one more time, if you want to submit questions to be included in the FAQ document, there is a form for you to submit those questions. It is at this link. It is also on the program webpage. And if you go to the FAQ itself, there's a yellow banner at the top of that FAQ document, and the link to submit your questions is provided there for you as well. So with that, we're going to start taking questions. Matt, I'm going to have you ask me the questions, because Tuesday when I tried to keep up with reading them, I was getting lost. So if you would just ask the questions, and we will go forward and answer questions for the next few minutes till we run out of time.
Great. We will, we're going off top questions that are voted up. So this has been up at the top for a while. If an LEA is moving salaries into ESSER to free up local money for expenditures to avoid the procurement restrictions associated with EDGAR, is this allowable? Will auditors be looking for this, even though the broad flexibility allows for it?
It is allowable. There is not any supplement, not supplant provision. So you can supplant state and local funds at the local level with this ESSER. A lot of flexibility around covering salary to free up state and local money for other uses. Really a lot of flexibility in how you use the ESSER 3 funding. It's very flexible, allowable uses. So it can cover many things that you would normally use state and local funds for, but it does not cover everything. So before you look at supplanting, and when you're really thinking about your use of funds in your planning process, you need to keep in mind that ESSER 3 is still a federal grant, and it still must follow all federal rules. So your allowable uses, or how you use this money, must, number one, meet the intent and purpose of the federal statute. So it must be addressing a need created by the pandemic. It must be reasonable and necessary, and it must align to one of the allowable uses in statute. Now, the other thing, when you're supplanting, the other thing you really have to keep in mind is that even though there's no local MOE requirement on ESSER, you still have to meet the local IDEA MOE requirements and the local ESSA MOE requirements. So under IDEA, it's 100% test for maintenance of effort. So you don't want to supplant your special ed spending, because it can make you non-compliant. You have to pay back money for being non-compliant with IDEA MOE. On your ESSA MOE, it is a 90% test. So you want to watch your budget and make sure you're only supplanting that 10% or less, so that you don't cause an MOE compliance process with the ESSA MOE, because the result of being non-compliant with ESSA MOE is we then are required to decrease all your ESSA program allocations by the same percent that you're non-compliant with the ESSA MOE requirement. So yes, you can supplant, yes, you can have a lot of flexibility to free up state and local money, but keep those other two local MOE requirements in the back of your mind to make sure you maintain compliance with them.
We're going to combine the next two questions, so make it a two-parter, they're related. Is it a bad idea to submit the application early since the legislature is considering plans to require districts to reserve a yet to be specified amount of ESSER 3 funding? What will this look like if Section 25 of CSHB 1525 eventually becomes law? Will it impact this presentation?
Any future changes can impact this presentation. What I would advise you is that nothing has been passed yet, and we are still in the legislative process, and a lot of things can happen between now and sine die and when the legislature ends. If something is passed that impacts this, we will put new information out to you at that time. Whether you want to submit your application early before those decisions are made, that's totally your decision. You may have the chance to make any adjustments during negotiation. If you submit a perfectly submitted application to us, you may have to call us and ask us to put it into negotiation because maybe we didn't have anything that we needed to talk about. But that's just a decision you have to make as to how fast you want to submit the application and get in the queue for approval. Until the legislature is actually closed and we find out everything that actually passes, it's anybody's guess right now.
Great, and just want to point out that Tasha posted a budgeting cost guidance handbook in the chat for anyone that's got specific questions about allowable uses of funds, so that's a good resource. The next question, Corey, will payroll, including pre-award, be considered a federal fund for TRS purposes?
That's a question we're trying to get an answer to. We're trying to get response from TRS. Under ESSER 1, because most of the payroll and pre-award was reimbursing other costs that were already made, they had answered that question for us. But right now we can't answer that question because we haven't heard back from TRS, because while there will be some payroll that is pre-award under ESSER 3, a lot of the payroll under ESSER 3 will be payroll going forward. And so unfortunately, that's the one question that I've been holding out of the FAQ for a week now until we get a final response from TRS.
Great, next question. Since there's pre-award that will allow us to use funding from March 13th, 2020, will we have to follow the 3-quote federal rule if we want to recode expenditures that local funds originally covered?
When pre-award is authorized, as it is under this grant, all 3 of the ESSER grants, it's been authorized by USDE to allow pre-award back to March 13th, 2020. What USD said under ESSER 1 was any of those costs that are under pre-award, you did not know you were going to have a federal grant to cover those costs at the time the expenditure was made. So you just have to make sure you followed state and local rules and policy on the procurements. Now, they haven't said that under ESSER 3, but I don't expect that answer to change. So we would expect the same process under ESSER 3 as we had under ESSER 1, that you had to start following federal procurement rules the date you got an allocation posted, which would be April 27th, that any pre-award costs before that date back to March 13th of 2020, you just have to document and ensure you follow the state and local rules that you were operating under at the time of the procurement.
Related to that, Corey, can an LEA use ESSER 3 funds for pre-award for salaries in which the school paid for days quarantined through the 2021 school year? This relates to the example, roughly $50,000 for subs and salaries, covering absentees due to COVID.
Yes, if you go to the FAQ document, the allowable uses section, question AU10, we talk about how you can pay salary, and the second paragraph of that response even tells you exactly how to justify it. And that does include pre-award salaries that would have been during time that the schools were closed. So it can be allowable. You just have to make sure you check all the boxes, meets the intent of the grant, tied to an allowable use, reasonable and necessary. But I explain all that in question AU10 in the FAQ, how you can justify salary. AU11 justifies like retention bonuses, those type activities. I do want to mention The word incentive is used in the budget schedule 6101, the support schedule 6101. Incentives are not ever allowed with federal grants. So you don't need to use the word incentives, because if it's truly an incentive, it's not allowable. But many people call retention stipends, retention bonuses an incentive. Don't use the word incentive. That makes it unallowable. Call it a retention bonus. Call it a retention stipend. So you need to pay attention to your wording. I've never caught that in the grant application. Honestly, I quit looking at grant applications years ago. I have a very capable staff who handle that. So at some point we may try to work on that wording, but just be aware, do not use the word incentives in your documentation for an auditor, because if they're a pretty savvy auditor, they're going to label that as an unallowed cost because it violates federal regulation with where incentives are not allowed. Call it a retention stipend, call it a retention bonus, call it something else. Just don't call it an incentive for an auditor.
Corey, the next one is goes back to planning and decision making, and it's a little long, but it's a popular one, so bear with me. But we're planning to seek input from our district decision-making committee. It's our site-based committee made up of all required stakeholders, where we will share allowable expenses, examples of ideas, and collect what the committee members feel are priorities. We will then consider that input when finalizing our plan, and we'll submit our application, use of funds plan, and safe return plan to our board at a board meeting as an informational item, where stakeholders will have the opportunity to provide input. Does this meet the ESSER 3 requirements for meaningful stakeholder input? Is there something more that's needed?
Well, first off, I can't tell you what's enough. That's up to you to decide based on your input and your community. What you're describing does follow pretty much the best practice that we offered in the FAQ document. The one thing I need to caution you on is if you're using only a site-based decision-making, make sure that committee meets all the groups represented in the federal rule for ESSER on stakeholder involvement. I just know I've sat on 2 site-based decision-making committees over the years, and neither one of them had that representation. So you've got to make sure that whatever stakeholder involvement process you're using, whatever group you're using for that process, that you have actual participation and representation of all those groups on the federal list. If you do, if you have all those groups in your federal site-based decision-making committee, then you're good to go. In the process of using the committee, having a public forum, public discussion at a board meeting, that all aligns to the best practices that we listed in the FAQ document.
Related to that, can the 6-month review of these plans be conducted by a properly constituted site-based committee, or will an LEA have to go through the same process for broad public comment?
You're required to review your return in-person instruction continuity of services plan every 6 months and make any revisions that are needed. If you're revising that plan on those 6-month reviews, you must follow the full stakeholder involvement process just like you did the first time. My caution here is in the wording of the question about fully compliant site-based decision-making. That can be interpreted in multiple ways. You have requirements in state statute about the representation on a site-based decision-making committee. That can be a fully compliant committee with state rules and not be fully compliant with the rule on the planning requirements under ESSER 3. So you just need to be aware of that. And just because you hear me say that committee could meet it, if you're interpreting fully compliant, meaning by state rule, that doesn't mean it's fully compliant by federal rules. Just make sure you're checking off all the boxes on the federal requirements, because part of the state plan that we have to submit the first week of June to get the remaining 1/3 of the funding to the state, we have to describe how we will monitor all these programmatic compliance requirements. So look at the dollar amount of ESSER 3. It's the biggest dollar amount federal award we've had come to TEA in the 26 years I've been doing this work. And we know it will be monitored and audited by Inspector General, by program offices at USDE, and we are required to monitor you, the LEAs. So just make sure you plan for being monitored and reviewed, both programmatically and fiscal reviews. Keep your documentation, create your documentation system up front, and the stakeholder involvement, the rules talk several times about the consultation process and it being a genuine consultation. So it will be reviewed and monitored. So just check all the boxes, keep the documentation, and make sure you're compliant with the federal rule.
Corey, we have 5 more minutes. I just want to remind folks, any question we don't get to, you can send through the FAQ form on the ARP ESSER 3 page, and we have 4 subsequent FAQ sessions. So if you have a question that's not going to be answered, submit it through the form and attend a QA session. Corey, next question. What can you tell districts about the 9.5% that TA is holding for discretionary funds? Will districts be able to apply for those funds, or will the state be holding on to those?
Well, the final decisions on that 9.5% state discretionary funds haven't been made yet, because we're collecting stakeholder input right now for the state plan, which has to describe what that money will be used for. You hopefully notice a TTAA letter that came out yesterday announcing the stakeholder input survey, where we can gather input from the state, from districts, charter schools, anyone who wants to provide input to us. That survey is available. The one thing it also does is it gives you a sample of what a survey might look like. You will notice that we're not asking a question about every single requirement we have to address in the state plan. We've pulled out the ones that we need input on and pulled out questions where we have a little less data maybe. So we've selected questions to put in the stakeholder involvement survey. Now, where you have 90 days to complete your plan, we have a much shorter time frame. Ours is due June 7th. So the survey posted yesterday, and it is due next Friday, the 21st, because of the short timeline we have for the plan. But once that's done, more information will be available to LEAs and the public about our plan for the 9.5% state level activity money. I can tell you there is a lot of conversation around providing services for districts and charters, but there's also lots of conversation around options of grants that you may be able to apply for as well. All those decisions will be finalized after we do the stakeholder involvement in the planning process for the state's plan.
And just a reminder, that survey is on the TTAA page. It was a recent correspondence if you're looking for that. Corey, what's the
the link is in the TTAA letter that will take you straight to the survey.
What's the expectation for percentages of drawing down and using funds over the 3 to 5 year period for a grantee LEA?
We really can't have a specific expectation because you have a lot of options. You have the pre-award allowed, you have a grant period with carryover that lasts over 3 years, and it's all based on your local needs. So depending on what you turn into us in the application, based on how much you're going to request pre-award, how many activities you're marking in the 2021 year, plus the summer of 21, how much you're putting in the 21-22, the 22-23, the 23-24 year, that would really create our expectation for your drawdown schedule, because it really depends on the flexibility you have and what your plan is for spending the money. What we do expect is that you are drawing down on a regular basis as you're having expenses, and that you're not waiting and doing one big drawdown at the end. Now, it's actually your choice, but I'm just telling you, this money is going to be monitored and not just auditing type monitoring. There are a lot of people interested in how districts are spending this money. There will be additional reporting. People will be looking at drawdowns. You may have drawn down the money locally and spend it locally, and maybe you just haven't done a drawdown with us yet. But on our records, it's going to show you have not expended any of your money, when in reality, you may have spent 25 or 30% of it already. So if you don't do regular drawdowns as you're expending the funds, sometimes reporting can give a little bit of a false idea as to how you're actually spending your money and how quickly you're drawing it down. But with this grant, where you've got such a long grant period plus pre-award, the expectation of drawdowns is really going to be based on what you submit in your application and your planning process.
Corey, two quick
We have time
questions
for
and
one question.
two quick yes or no's that have already been stated. The indirect cost rate that applies to this is unrestricted, correct?
Yes, because you do not have a supplement not supplant provision, you may use your unrestricted indirect cost rate.
And then the translation policy is a requirement, not a best practice, correct? And where can someone find that requirement?
I believe that is required because it's required under some of your other federal programs. Submit that to the FAQ and I'll find the actual requirement and we'll post it in the FAQ for you.
And this one was hanging at the top, and we'll close with this one, Corey. We plan to create and expand after-school, summer, and community-based tutoring and learning activities. Is it allowable to pay student workers 16 and older to work under the supervision of professional staff? Professional staff and student workers would both assist students engaged in these activities.
So the question is, it allowable to pay students to work in tutoring programs for younger students, basically?
Yeah,
Under
at the age of
direct
16,
supervision
correct.
of professional staff. That could be allowable. What I do need to caution you against is we've also had several questions, people wanting to just directly pay students for themselves to attend summer school. That's not allowable. We've had people wanting to pay students to take a college class. That's not allowable. Those are incentives and they're not allowed. You could potentially pay the students to tutor younger students under that direct supervision. That could be allowable. With that, we're going to close. Time is actually up and I don't want to get shut off by the system. I do want to tell you, thank you for all the work you're doing. We all understand this is one crazy year. Everyone is ready for the end of the year. I have two children who are teachers themselves, and I hear it on an almost daily basis. They're ready for this year to be over. Students feel the same way, and we understand that. So I want to thank you for everything you're doing for the kids, everything you're doing to try to help accelerate their learning. And, you know, we know you have questions. Keep sending those questions in, and we will process them into that FAQ document just as quick as we can. And the recording of this will be sent out to you hopefully later today, with all the materials about this training. You can always find our recordings on that website, the playlist for the department on TEA's YouTube site. All of our recordings there, this will be added there as well. So thank you for your time and thank you for everything you're doing for students.